Hello there. Welcome to Skeptics in the Pub Online. Nice of so many of you to jump in and see what we're doing tonight. I mean, it's been 5 years, but there still might be people out there who see us for the very first time. So who are we, Skeptics in the Pub Online? We are basically a group of people who were running local Skeptics in the Pub groups for quite some time, mainly in the UK, a few Europeans. And when COVID hit 5 years ago, we decided, we'll try to do that online. Here we are 5 years later. We're still doing one talk a month on the fourth Thursday of each month. We're hosting a virtual pub every week on Thursday, starting at 8:30 or directly after the talk if we have one on. And we're publishing our past talks as podcasts. You've got a YouTube archive to look at. We've got social media. We've got our own Discord server. We've got a little merch channel in case you're interested. And now you're wondering, how can I get access to all of that? Answer is simple, sitp.online. That's our website. I repeat, for those who didn't catch it, sitp.online. It's coming up to QED every day a little bit more. And we've got a few things we need to organize for that. Number one, we've been once again invited to host the Skeptic Camp on the Friday afternoon or Friday during the day, which will be a free event. You just show up and you can come in and you can watch it. And if you're really brave, you can give a talk. The whole thing is explained on our website, sitp.online/QED. And there you will also find the link on how to apply if you want to give a talk. It's open. You can apply anytime. So we're looking forward to as many ideas as possible so we can get some really good talks out there again. We also organize an attendance fund every year for people who can't afford it themselves to go. I know the organizers are making every effort to keep it reasonable, but it costs money and some people don't have that available. So that's why the attendance fund comes in. There's, of course, two ways to use that. You can either apply to benefit from it. Again, sitp.online/QED. So you can do that. Or you can use that same address, sitp.online/QED, to donate to that fund and help us to get as many people as possible to QED for the last time. As you all most likely have heard by now, it's going to be the final QED, so let's make it a really good one. Anything else? We're going to have this talk now. After the talk, we'll have a 15-minute break so everybody can get a drink, get to the loo, whatever you need. And after that, we'll have some questions and answers. Throughout the talk, and also during the break, of course, you can put in your questions if you've got anything you want to know. We've got a link for that, again, sitp.online/ask, which will take you directly to our Slido page where you can put in questions. Have a look at it anyway, because you can see the questions that already have been put in, and you can rate those that you find most interesting with a simple thumbs up icon. So that will help us to make sure that the most interesting questions get asked, and for sure. I think that's all the household stuff I have to do today. So let's talk about today's speaker. Until a few minutes ago, I was under the impression I would be completing my own hat trick with a K today. But I've never introduced Marsh. But at least I'm getting the second notch on my bedpost for this one. So today we're welcoming Mike Hall. For those of you who really don't know about him yet, which is hard to believe, Mike Hall, by day, he's a web developer. By night, he's a Doctor Who fan. And in between, he is a founding member of the Merseyside Skeptics Society, where he currently serves as secretary and treasurer. He's been producing and presenting the popular skeptical podcast Skeptics with a K since 2009, which is by now the longest running skeptical podcast in the UK. Actually, it's the longest running one, except for the one or the other American one that I'm aware of. He's also on the organizing team for QED that I mentioned before. So one more time, he's doing that job. So really looking forward. But tonight, he's going to give us a talk about a completely different subject. It's not about Doctor Who. It's not about the word that I can't think of at the moment. Now, tonight, we're talking about Jack the Ripper. So Mike, if you want to take the stage, they're all yours.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. My name is Mike. As was mentioned, I'm Doctor Who fan and I'm a web developer. I have no special insight. I have no special expertise on anything that I'm about to talk about tonight. But I hope it's something that you find interesting. It's something I'm kind of passingly interested in. I'm passingly interested in the subject of serial killers. Serial killers have got an undeniable hold over our collective cultural attention, right? So if you turn on Netflix right now, for example, you'll find dozens of true crime documentaries. There are podcasts about serial murderers, which are some of the most popular podcasts on the planet, are podcasts about serial murder. And if you walk into any major bookstore, you're going to find sections on serial killer biographies and histories of serial killers throughout the ages. So you can see we have this huge cultural interest in serial killers, and this fascination with serial murder also bleeds over into our fiction as well. So one very famous case of this is a guy called Ed Gein. So Ed Gein was a serial killer, real serial killer, who was arrested in Wisconsin in 1957. And this single man was responsible for events that were so bizarre and gruesome that he inspired the creation of Leatherface for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. He was also the inspiration for Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. And he was the inspiration for Norman Bates in Psycho. This one person became all three of these characters. But while killers like Gein have gone on to a form of cultural immortality, I suppose, relatively few people could name even one of the people that he killed. And these were people who had lives and hopes and friends and hobbies, and they're now reduced to a footnote and almost a trivia question in somebody else's story. And that's something I kind of have a hard time with. So this mythologizing that we have of serial killers isn't really a new thing. It's something that's been going on for generations. And no case of this kind is more enduring and culturally influential than the unidentified serial killer known as Jack the Ripper, who was responsible for a series of deaths known as the Whitechapel murders. So just to give you a few examples of the influence of this individual, the Alan Moore comic From Hell portrays the Whitechapel murders as part of an occult conspiracy involving the Freemasons. There was a Hammer horror movie. I think this started as a radio play, and eventually Hammer made a movie version of it called Room to Let, which depicts a man called Dr. Fell, who turns out to be Jack. Spoilers for Room to Let. He turns out to be Jack the Ripper, who is now kind of hiding in recluse long after the murders took place. Star Trek, of all things, says that Jack the Ripper was an alien creature called Red Jack, who possesses Scotty and starts killing again. And another Hammer production, Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, portrays Hyde as responsible for the Whitechapel murders, while Jekyll struggles with the horrifying things that his alter ego is doing. And there's also a significant amount of pseudoscience around the Whitechapel murders. So there are hoaxed diaries, there are faked letters, there are conspiracy theories involving insane aristocrats and members of the royal family. This photograph that's on screen here is what's referred to as the Saucy Jack postcard, which is widely believed to have been a hoax. And it was a hoax that was perpetrated at the time. You could see an 1888 postmark on this. And fake letters like this were quite common at the time. And in fact, even the name Jack the Ripper came from a letter which is widely believed to have been a hoax and not actually written by the killer themselves. But here's the thing, is these conspiracies and these hoaxes, at least in part, persist because after 140 years, we still have no idea who Jack the Ripper was. But maybe that's something that's about to change. So earlier this year, several news outlets and blogs reported on breakthrough new DNA evidence, which they claim positively identifies the killer as a Polish immigrant named Aaron Kosminski. And there were even calls for the courts to legally recognize Kosminski as Jack the Ripper and formally close the Whitechapel case. So where does this new evidence come from? So as the story goes, a silk shawl was found beside the body of Catherine Eddowes, who was the fourth of the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. So that the canonical 5 are 5 individuals who is widely agreed to have been victims of Jack the Ripper. There are other people who were murdered around the same time that there is speculation as to whether they were the victims of Jack the Ripper or the victims of other killers. But there are 5 victims who are widely agreed to be canonical to Jack the Ripper. So a silk shawl was supposedly found beside the body of the 4th victim, Catherine Eddowes. And a police officer named Amos Simpson recovered this shawl and took it home as a gift for his wife, who was a seamstress. And quite understandably, his wife thought that this was a shit gift, because it is. A reasonable reaction, to my mind. But instead of throwing it away or, destroying it or whatever, she put the shawl unwashed into effectively a linen cupboard. I think it was actually kept in a trunk. But it was put away unwashed and then passed down through the family line for over a century, until 2007, when Amos Simpson's great-great-nephew sold it at auction. The buyer was this scouse-faced gentleman, who is a guy named Russell Edwards. Edwards is a businessman from Birkenhead who developed an interest in ripperology after watching the movie version of the comic From Hell. That's the movie starring Johnny Depp. And after buying the shawl, Edwards took it to a molecular biologist at Liverpool John Moores University, who's named Dr. Jari Louhelainen. And Louhelainen undertook an examination of the shawl, a forensic examination of the shawl, using modern cold case techniques. So a few years later, Edwards announced to much fanfare in the Mail on Sunday that he and Louhelainen had identified DNA on the shawl from Catherine Eddowes and also DNA from Aaron Kosminski. And therefore, this establishes that the shawl was at the crime scene and Kosminski was the killer, and so the case is closed. Now, these were findings that were first announced over a decade ago. The shawl was purchased in 2007. The forensic examination happened in 2011. And the results were first published in the Daily Mail in 2014, shortly before Edwards published his book on the subject, which was called Naming Jack the Ripper. The science that Louhelainen undertook was eventually published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019. So this story is actually very much old news. As best I can tell, the recent revival in media interest and why suddenly all the papers started covering it again earlier this year is simply because Edwards has published a second edition of his book, which came out last October. But whatever the cause of the renewed interest, there is still one major problem with this story. It's bollocks, right? So what I'm going to do this evening is we're going to talk about some of the reasons why we can be confident that this is bollocks. And this is going to be broken down into 3 key criticisms. So first, we're going to talk about the provenance of the shawl itself, the chain of custody where the shawl has come from. Next, we're going to talk about the DNA analysis itself. And then finally, we're going to talk about Aaron Kosminski. But let's start off, we'll talk about the shawl. Because it turns out that there is no contemporary documentation that indicates there was a shawl of any kind discovered with Catherine Eddowes. The list of items that was discovered with Eddowes is huge and includes such trivial things as a red mitten, an empty matchbox, a thimble, like nonsense items that would seem to be not even worth mentioning. But they are there in the catalogue. This list I've got up on screen isn't even complete. But despite cataloguing inconsequential items like a mitten, an 8-foot silk shawl was not on the list of items discovered with the body. So one explanation for this suggests that Amos Simpson removed the shawl from the crime scene before Eddowes' belongings had been catalogued, an act which would constitute a serious dereliction of duty, even back then, especially on such a high-profile case. Also, from what I've been able to tell, reading about Amos Simpson in his life, he seems to have been a pretty straight up and down guy, and stealing evidence is unlikely to have been one of his hobbies. On top of that, the shawl itself is extremely large. So large, in fact, that some people have speculated that it might not be a shawl at all, but actually a table runner. There are good reasons to think that maybe it's not a shawl, including things like the blue dye you can see on the blue section of the shawl. The dye there is not water safe. It runs in the rain. What use is a shawl where the color runs when it gets wet? And also a piece of silk this large, whatever it's for, would have been very valuable. And Eddowes is recorded as having lived in poverty. In fact, one of the things that was discovered on her was a ticket from a pawnbroker where she had recently pawned a pair of shoes. It would seem to indicate that she didn't have an awful lot of money if she was pawning shoes. And it would seem odd that she's doing that while retaining this very expensive silk shawl. Russell Edwards, who wrote Naming Jack the Ripper, speculates that the shawl in fact belongs to the killer. And he goes on to argue that the shawl was left at the crime scene to be found as a deliberate clue. And the clue was this. The clue was this pattern, which supposedly features Michaelmas daisies. Now, I'll be honest, I'm not completely persuaded that this pattern features Michaelmas daisies, but I'll let that slide for now. Michaelmas, or the Feast of St. Michael, is a largely forgotten Christian tradition today, but it was still celebrated by Christians in the Victorian era. And unusually, it is a feast that has two dates. So in the Western tradition, Michaelmas is held on September 29th. And in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, it is held on November the 8th. And so it turns out that these are actually also the dates of the final three Whitechapel murders. So September 29th was the date upon which both Eddowes and Elizabeth Stride were killed. And November 8th was the date of the final murder, that of Mary Jane Kelly. So Edwards' claim is that the killer left the shawl on the 29th, featuring these daisies specifically, as a hint to the fact that his next murder would be on the 8th, the other date for the same feast. So he kills on the 29th, which is one of the dates for the feast, and leaves the shawl to tell police that he's going to kill again on the other date, which is the 8th. And while it's not beyond the realms of possibility for a serial killer to behave symbolically in this way, there is no contemporary evidence that indicates that Jack the Ripper operated like this. And quite honestly, the argument smacks of a Texas sharpshooter fallacy. For those of you who aren't familiar with the informal logical fallacies, the Texas sharpshooter fallacy derives its name from the story of a cowboy who shoots the side of a barn and then finds the bullet hole and draws the bullseye around it. So it looks like that was always where he intended to hit. In this case, the apparent specificity of these dates is only really clear in retrospect. And I would argue that if the murders had been conducted on different dates, there would have just been some other rationale to justify why those dates were still the meaningful dates. Speaking of which, it actually turns out that the murders were conducted on different dates, because Stride and Eddowes were not killed on September 29th. They were killed the following day, in the early hours of September 30th. Mary Jane Kelly was in fact not killed on November the 8th either. She was killed the following day, on November the 9th. So even the notion that these dates of the feast mirror the dates of the murders doesn't actually really hold water. But let's for a moment, we'll give the story the benefit of the doubt. Let's accept, okay, maybe you can argue that the evening of the 29th is kind of the same thing as the morning of the 30th, because it was like 2 a.m., 1 a.m., something like that. So we'll let that go. Let's also accept that maybe the shawl is some esoteric hint about the date of the next murder. Let's even accept that the killer took the shawl to the crime scene and then decided for some reason to leave it next to the body of the second of his two victims last night, because uniquely on September the 30th, there were two murders. This was the only time Jack the Ripper did this. Catherine Eddowes and Elizabeth Stride were murdered about an hour apart. And for whatever reason, the killer decided to leave the shawl next to the second victim and not the first. But okay, let's leave that. Let's let that be. Even if we accept all of that, Michaelmas is a Christian tradition, and Aaron Kosminski, who Edwards claims is Jack the Ripper, was Jewish. So is it reasonable for us to suppose that a Jewish man would have known the date of this specifically Christian feast? In fact, is it reasonable to suppose that he not only knew the date of the Western version of the feast, but also the Eastern Orthodox version of the feast? And as an aside, we have very few records about the life of Aaron Kosminski, but the records we do have indicate that he was not a well-educated man. So the story starts to stretch the limits of credulity. The next problem that we have with the Shawl story is maybe even more fundamental. There is no evidence that Amos Simpson, who supposedly discovered the shawl, was ever at the crime scene. Acting Sergeant Amos Simpson joined the Metropolitan Police in 1868, where he was posted to Y Division. In 1886, he transferred to N Division, but Catherine Eddowes was murdered in Mitre Square, which is within the jurisdiction of the City of London Police. It is not within the jurisdiction of N Division. In fact, it's not within the jurisdiction of the Metropolitan Police at all. City of London Police is an entirely different force. Overall, the Whitechapel investigation was being run by officers from H Division, which is where the murders mostly took place. But that's also not why Simpson worked either. Amos Simpson had no business being at the crime scene, and the area where Eddowes was found, Mitre Square, is 25 miles away from where Amos Simpson was stationed, which was at Cheshire. Now, according to the oral family tradition that accompanies the shawl, Simpson was on special duties that night and was the first officer to discover Eddowes. However, this also contradicts the official account. So there were no records indicating that Amos Simpson was seconded to another force at the time. And the official record shows that Constable Edward Watkins was the officer who discovered Eddowes, not Amos Simpson. A list of those present at the crime scene does not include Amos Simpson. And it is also Watkins who presented evidence at the inquest. Simpson does not even attend. Now, we might speculate that maybe Simpson had somehow strayed from his beat and happened upon Eddowes and then took the shawl and left before Watkins arrived. But the historical record challenges even this admittedly stretching theory. So again, from police records at the time, PC Watkins had patrolled through Mitre Square at 1:30 a.m. and saw nothing unusual at this time. At 1:30 a.m., witnesses saw Catherine Eddowes speaking with a man near Church Passage, which is just outside of Mitre Square. At 1:40 a.m., PC James Harvey walks through Church Passage to the edge of Mitre Square, where he reports that he saw nothing out of the ordinary. And then at 1:45 a.m., PC Watkins' beat returned him to the square, where he discovered the body of Catherine Eddowes. So Eddowes had been seen alive at 1:35, was found dead at 1:45, and in between times, James Harvey had walked through that area and seen nothing of interest. Now, even leaving a little bit of slack in these timings for bad recollections and maybe watchers aren't being kept a good time and that sort of thing, this leaves still 5 to 10 minutes maybe for the killer to murder and mutilate Eddowes, leave the shawl and flee the scene, and then for Simpson, who somehow is miles from his beat, to find the body, decide to steal the evidence, take the shawl and disappear before Watkins returns. Again, I think we are very much stretching the limits of credulity. But let's give it the benefit of the doubt. Let's for the moment grant that the killer wanted to leave an oblique clue to taunt the police, so acquired somehow an expensive shawl featuring Michaelmas daisies to leave beside a victim's body. And let's also grant that Amos Simpson, for some reason, stole the shawl and instead of throwing it away or giving it away or even giving it a wash, puts it in a cupboard for 100 years. Let's grant all of that. And also grant that it somehow managed to evade police records that any of this happened, but was still passed down in the oral tradition of Amos Simpson's family. How does any of that get us to Aaron Kosminski? So after purchasing the shawl, Russell Edwards hired Dr. Jari Lohalainen to analyze the shawl. Initially, he claims with the goal of demonstrating that the shawl was authentic, because even at the time it was put up for auction, people did not believe that this was genuine physical evidence from the crime scene. Now, most people are going to be passingly familiar with DNA, or more specifically, we're going to be familiar with genomic DNA. So this is the molecule that exists in your cells that can be understood as providing instructions for how to make a U. You get your DNA from your parents, which they get from their parents, and so on and so forth. So in principle, it should be possible to extract DNA from the shawl and match that to the descendants of Catherine Eddowes. And that will demonstrate that this is likely Eddowes' DNA on the shawl, and therefore that the shawl is genuine. But there are problems with this approach. The one that really matters, there's several problems with it, but the one that really matters is this. DNA is quite a fragile molecule. And in normal temperature and humidity, it can be expected to become unreadable within a few months, certainly not 100 years. And the DNA on the shawl, if there is any, is over 100 years old. So it is likely to have degraded quite significantly in this time, reducing the chance of getting a match with any kind of confidence. In his 2019 paper for the Journal of Forensic Science, Lohalainen describes how he examined the shawl instead, looking for mitochondrial DNA, which is less likely to have degraded. So using a novel vacuuming technique that he developed, he was able to extract mitochondrial DNA from the bloodstains on the shawl and matched those mitochondrial DNAs to a descendant of Catherine Eddowes. Confirmation, it appears, that the shawl was at the crime scene. But I would argue that this too is an overstatement, because unlike genomic DNA, mitochondrial DNA is passed down the maternal line only, and is not typically able to identify an individual as specifically as genomic DNA. So yes, the mitochondrial DNA may have matched Eddowes, but it also could have matched hundreds or thousands of other people living in London at the time. If it had failed to match Eddowes, that would have ruled out that this was Eddowes' blood on the shawl. But a positive match does not confirm it was Eddowes, because it could still be from thousands of other people who share the same mitochondrial DNA. More controversially, Lohalainen also identified what appeared to be a semen stain on the shawl. And from within that semen stain, he recovered an epithelial cell. So these are the cells which coat your organs. And in this case, in the semen stain, there is a very good chance that the epithelial cell would have come from the lining of the urethra during ejaculation. So from this cell, Lohalainen was able to link the semen stain on the shawl to modern relatives of Aaron Kosminski. So now we have apparently matched the blood on the shawl to Eddowes and the semen to Kosminski, which is looking pretty bad for Kosminski, right? Although this link suffers from the same problem that we described before. This is mitochondrial DNA, and so while it might appear to match Kosminski, it could well have matched many, many other people who lived in London at the time. But there are still bigger problems with this analysis and how it was done. The invocation of semen here is particularly problematic in itself, because while there seems to have been some sexual elements to the Whitechapel murders, given the victims were exclusively women and often had organs, including sexual organs, removed, there is no evidence that Jack the Ripper assaulted his victims in a manner that would have left semen at the crime scene. There's no evidence that Jack the Ripper ejaculated at the crime scene. This is just not a known feature of the Whitechapel murders. In response to this criticism, Lohalainen argued that Victorian forensic science was very rudimentary and the investigators lacked modern tools like UV lights that were able to detect semen. And while this is a valid criticism of historical forensic methods, it's also a circular argument. Because yes, we didn't have the nice fancy crime lights that told us that, but the reasoning doesn't make sense, because the reasoning goes that, you know, Kosminski is Jack the Ripper. Well, that's great. How do you know Kosminski is Jack the Ripper? Well, it's because his semen is on the shawl. Okay, but why would there be semen on the shawl? Well, Jack the Ripper must have left the semen on the shawl. Okay, but how do we know that Jack the Ripper left semen on the shawl? Well, because Kosminski's semen is on the shawl. But we still don't know that Kosminski is Jack the Ripper. We are assuming the conclusion in the premise. But this is all a little bit wishy-washy from me. Mitochondrial, and it might match and it might not. And, you know, it's not the strongest rebuttal, I will grant. I think Edwards and Lohalainen are overstating their case by saying this is proof positive that Kosminski is the killer. But the most robust criticism that I've managed of the DNA evidence so far is just to add the words maybe, right? Maybe this is Edo's blood. Maybe this is Kosminski's semen. And ultimately, that's kind of all we have right now. There are two sets of DNA on the shawl. One seemingly belonged to somebody who died, so the other must belong to the person who killed her. So are there more robust criticisms that we can make than this? So between 1991 and 2001, the shawl was on loan to the Metropolitan Police Museum, although it appears that the police never actually put it on display because they had doubts over its authenticity. After this, it was DNA tested as part of a Channel 5 documentary in 2006. Channel 5's findings were inconclusive. It also, after this time, was exhibited at a number of Jack the Ripper conventions. At these conventions, the shawl was handled a lot. Even here, we can see Russell Edwards is handling the shawl with bare hands. He's not wearing gloves when he is posing for this picture. The shawl does not appear to have been kept in anything approaching reasonable forensic conditions and has had ample opportunity to be contaminated over the last 100 years, including by people connected to the case. In fact, a report from the Times in 2014 said that 3 of Edo's descendants were known to have been in the same room as the shawl for several days during a Jack the Ripper event. So even just breathing near this thing could be enough to contaminate it with exactly the mitochondrial DNA that supposedly proves it was at the crime scene. So the forensic case here is far from robust, and the scientific community agrees. Because as I mentioned before, Lohalainen's analysis was published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences in 2019, but almost immediately it was met with heavy criticism questioning the validity of the analysis and of its conclusions. Lohalainen responded with rebuttals, but the debate was significant enough for the journal's editor to request a copy of the raw data supporting the study. Unfortunately, Lohalainen was unable to provide that raw data, citing an instrument failure. As a result, the Journal of Forensic Sciences published an expression of concern, which is a formal notice that is attached to this paper, warning readers that its content may be unreliable. Now, these notices are not issued lightly, and it remains attached to this paper today. And when I checked earlier today, it is still attached to this paper, the warning from the journal that we don't think that this content is reliable. Another issue with the DNA analysis is it turns out that Aaron Kosminski was the only suspect that Edwards and Lohalainen chose to test. So why is that? It turns out this is because Edwards already believed that Kosminski was the killer. Before the analysis had even started, he had already decided that this was the case. So they did not test DNA from any other suspect. What they did was go looking for confirmation of what Edwards already had decided was true. So why had he decided that Aaron Kosminski specifically was the killer? So that brings us to the final section, which is the identity of Kosminski. Because the historical record isn't even clear that Aaron Kosminski was ever a genuine suspect in the Whitechapel case. Much of the emphasis on Kosminski comes from an 1894 memo written by this bloke, Melvin McNaughton, who was the Assistant Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police. This memo was written 5 years after the final murder. So the Whitechapel killings happened in late 1888. This memo was written in 1894. So like 4 to 5 years later, 5 to 6 years later after the final killing. In this memo, McNaughton names his 3 suspects that he believed were responsible for the killings. So the suspects he named were Montague Druitt, who was a barrister who died suddenly in December of 1888, and that coincided with the end of the Whitechapel murders. Maybe that's because he was the guy who did it and he died and therefore the murders stopped. Not that I'm suggesting that is the case, but that's the speculation around Montague Druitt. The second suspect he names was Michael Ostrog, who was a Russian con man and a thief. Can say that because you can't libel the dead. And finally, a man he refers to simply as Kosminski. No name, no first name is given, only referred to as Kosminski. And Macnaghten describes Kosminski as a Polish Jew living in Whitechapel who was committed to an asylum in 1889. So, okay, maybe that could be Aaron Kosminski. He was also a Polish Jew, but then with a surname like Kosminski, I imagine every Kosminski in London was a Polish Jew. It doesn't necessarily mean that it was Aaron. Some decades later, Sir Robert Anderson, who was the Assistant Police Commissioner, wrote a memoir. And in his memoir, he also refers to a Polish suspect. Now, he does not name this suspect as Kosminski specifically. But it turns out that Anderson's book was fairly popular and was bought by an awful lot of people. One person who bought a copy of the book was this guy, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, who wrote in his personal copy of Anderson's memoir, he wrote the words, "Kosminski was the suspect," in the margin beside this paragraph. This became known in Ripper circles, Ripperology circles, as the Swanson marginalia, even though it is essentially one officer's handwritten interpretation of what another officer was referring to in their memoir many years later. In the marginalia, Swanson further notes that Kosminski had been sent to the asylum at Colney Hatch and that he had died shortly afterwards. Kosminski was the suspect. It wasn't until 1987, almost 100 years later, that researchers first suggested that the suspect named Kosminski was actually Aaron Kosminski, on the basis of Aaron being the only individual that they could find named Kosminski in the surviving records from the Colney Hatch Asylum. And while that might seem compelling, there are also significant differences between the suspect Kosminski and Aaron Kosminski. So both were Polish and Jewish, which again, with that surname, it will be a surprise if they weren't. They also both lived in Whitechapel, but there was also a fairly large Polish population living in Whitechapel at the time. Following the assassination of Tsar Alexander in 1881, tens of thousands of European Jews, many of them from Poland, fled to the UK and settled in London. So again, it's not necessarily a surprise that he was a Jew who lived in Whitechapel. There was a large Jewish population at the time. They were also both sent to the asylum at Colney Hatch, but being institutionalized was also very common back then, and could happen for any number of reasons. London was full of what they referred to as pauper asylums, where poor people could be sent for the most trivial of things, including what they referred to as idiocy, which effectively meant you couldn't hold down a job, but also what they referred to as moral insanity, which included things like enjoying having a wank. That was enough to get you sent to an asylum. But this is where we also start to see differences between the suspect named Kosminski and Aaron Kosminski, because the suspect is described as having been sent to Colney Hatch in March of 1889 and having died shortly thereafterwards. In contrast, Aaron Kosminski was not sent to Colney Hatch until the February of 1891, so 2 years later, and he died a quarter of a century after that in 1919. So in fact, when Swanson wrote in that margin that Kosminski died, Aaron Kosminski was actually still alive. Now, Russell Edwards has described the findings to be the final word on the Whitechapel murders and says that anyone who is unmoved by his shawl and his arguments are simply unbelievers who are motivated to perpetuate the mystery. Now, I've got no particular enthusiasm for the Jack the Ripper case. I wouldn't especially describe myself as a Ripperologist, nor do I claim any deep knowledge on the Whitechapel killings or Jack the Ripper or serial killers or anything along those lines. In fact, as I alluded to at the start, I find the public fascination with serial killers somewhat vulgar, to be honest. And the sanitization of Jack the Ripper through popular culture, I think, robs the Whitechapel murders of some of their horror. Can you imagine being somebody sitting down watching television in 1967 and seeing the person responsible for your mother or your grandmother turning up as a villain on Star Trek, right? I can't imagine how somebody would respond to that. That must be such a distressing thing to happen. I don't know that that happened, but the children of some of Jack the Ripper's victims were still alive at the time that Star Trek episode aired, at the time Hammer was making those movies. I don't think it's a pleasant thing to do to somebody. So while it is entirely possible that Aaron Kosminski is the true identity of Jack the Ripper, maybe he is, maybe he genuinely is, the evidence and arguments presented in support of this contain so many gaps and flaws that they fail to be convincing. We have a shawl of dubious provenance that it almost certainly has been contaminated. We've got DNA tests that have been rejected by the scientific community, pointing at a suspect that we have scant evidence was ever involved in the killings at all, and is only suggested as a suspect 100 years after the fact. So maybe instead of raking over this story endlessly, maybe we should consider whether setting up murderers as cultural icons is a healthy thing for us to be doing. And maybe it's time we should be moving on from Jack the Ripper. So thank you very much for listening and for taking up some time. If you enjoyed this, you might also enjoy my podcast, Skeptics with a K. That features myself and Marsh and Alice talking about science and pseudoscience and social media and conspiracies. And in fact, we covered this story when it first came out in the Mail on Sunday in 2014. And so we cover everything, in between those things. And you'll find that wherever you get your podcasts. And we are now publishing episodes weekly. That's a new thing for this year as we went weekly. And I also want to give a final big plug before I hand back over. I should also give a final big plug for QED. So QED is the annual conference that we run in Manchester every year. And this year is, as we've said, is the final event. And we're going to be going out with a bang with the biggest and best skeptical party that you've ever been to. We've got an absolutely stellar lineup, including Robin Ince and Jamie Gallagher and Anna Poshaysky and Annie Kelly and Naomi Ryan. And of course, Michael Marshall, who is very much of this parish, with many, many more people to be announced. And the tickets have absolutely flown out of the door. And in fact, as of today, I think we have announced that there are fewer than 50 tickets remaining. And I'm comfortable enough saying there are quite a fewer than 50 tickets remaining. So if you want to come, you really need to get your skates on. But sorry, I will wrap up. There is one more thing, because exclusive to Skeptics in the Pub Online, we haven't formally announced this yet. So this is just for you. Not only will we be recording a live episode of Skeptics with a K at QED, but I can announce that for the final QED ever, we will be welcoming Dr. Abby Phillips, also known as the liver doc. So Abby is a clinical scientist working in hepatology and a medical science communicator and public health and social media activist. And he is the leading authority on supplement-induced liver injuries, combating health misinformation and superstition and dogma around the Indian subcontinent, which has also made him the target of multiple legal threats from the homeopathy and Ayurveda industries. And we will also be welcoming Subhadra Das. So Subhadra is a writer, historian, and broadcaster and comedian who looks at the relationship between science and society. And she specializes in the history of the philosophy of science, and particularly the history of scientific racism and eugenics. So that is a pair of exclusives for you at Skeptics of the Pub Online. That's it from me. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, Mike. That was great. And yeah, we always take a special. Thanks for that. Well, we're going to have a break in a moment, and then we'll do the Q&A. Just a reminder, if you want to put in a question or rate the ones that are already there, you need to go to sitp.online/ask. It also seems that during my introduction, I got a little bit overexcited with all my links, and I have to correct myself. So listen closely. If you want to apply for giving a talk at Skepticamp, the address you need is sitp.online/Skepticamp. For any donations or applications for the attendance fund, it's sitp.online/QED. I apologize for mixing this up earlier on. We'll now have our 15 minutes break, and we'll be back at 8 o'clock. Thank you. Welcome back. I hope everyone was able to use the break as they wanted to. So, Mike, we'll have to do a Q&A now. Before we do that, I just want to dangle the carrot. After the talk, we'll open our online pub, the Razor, Lock-ins Razor. Once again, the website is the gateway that will take you there, sitp.online/virtual pub. Now, to your questions. We'll start with the easy one, the one we always have. Do you have a cat or a pet?
I do have a cat. I have 3 cats. And in fact, so my 3 cats are called Rory and Leopold, although we just call him Big Chungus because he's quite a hefty boy, and Hubert Cumberdale. But it's Leopold's birthday today. He's 8 years old today. So he's off full of dreamies somewhere, having a nice time.
Deservedly. Did Jack the Ripper have a cat? Sorry.
I wish I could tell you if Jack the Ripper. I know Aaron Kosminski had a dog. When I was researching this piece, I found a newspaper report of Aaron Kosminski being arrested for walking a dog without a muzzle on the dog, presumably not on himself. So I know Aaron Kosminski had a dog, but I don't know whether he had a cat or not.
I don't dare to ask the next one. Again, anonymous. Come on, at least give us a name and stand up for it. Did any of the victims have a cat?
I wish I had an answer for that. I've got no idea.
Okay, thank you. Can we go for the real questions now, please? Okay. Dave J asks, where did the name Jack the Ripper actually come from? You referred to it as the Watergate murders. So where is the Jack the Ripper coming from?
Yeah, so as I talked about, there was a lot of hoaxes around the Whitechapel killings at the time, and the police were and the press were constantly in receipt of fabricated letters that claimed to be from the killer, and one such letter was signed Jack the Ripper. Now, it's widely believed that that letter was not actually from the real killer, that it was one of the hoaxes. But the name somehow stuck. And so that's where the name Jack the Ripper came from. It was actually a hoax perpetrated by someone pretending to be Jack the Ripper, presumably to just stoke the fires or whatever thrill they were getting out of pretending to be a killer.
Yeah. Okay. Another anonymous question. Why do you think we as a society get so obsessed with serial killers? Is this a new thing in the last century or so?
I don't know. I think it's a kind of dread fascination. It's a peculiar thing as to why somebody would be motivated to do these things. It's not something that I really understand, the fascination with serial killers, but it is something that holds a lot of fascination, as indeed does a lot of true crime, holds a lot of fascination for an awful lot of people. I wish there was an answer that I could give you as to why it is that people are so fascinated with it. I think it is the case that it's a reasonably new phenomenon, the fascination we have with serial killers. But even so, I'd mentioned that the book of Psycho was based on Ed Gein, who was a serial killer from the 1950s. And that book was written by an author called Robert Bloch, or Robert Bloch. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. Mm-hmm. And Robert Bloch was a horror writer. He wrote an awful lot of horror movies. In fact, Psycho was unusual in the sense that there wasn't a supernatural element to it, because mostly in Robert Bloch's work there was. I know much more about Robert Bloch than I know about Jack the Ripper. But it was unusual in his work. And he was good friends with H.P. Lovecraft, and they used to correspond with each other. But the Ed Gein killings was enough to get people like Bloch writing a story about it. The Star Trek script about Jack the Ripper was also written by Robert Bloch, who based it on a short story that he'd written. And in his short story, Jack the Ripper was a demon who possessed various people. And when he rewrote the story for Star Trek, he changed it from a demon to an alien, but it was largely the same plot. So Bloch had a fascination with the macabre and serial killers, both from Ed Gein and from the Jack the Ripper perspective, which has come out things like Tales from the Crypt and Amazing Stories and those kind of pulp, horror comic books that were around, kind of in the post-war era. So maybe it's something that's kind of post-war. I don't think there was a huge fascination before that. But as I say, Jack the Ripper, there was huge media fascination around him at the time. So I think it's relatively new. But maybe the phenomenon of serial killers is also relatively new. They probably existed before that, but the lack of media would mean that we wouldn't know that that was what they were.
I just have got this mental picture of a few white wine guzzling women recording a true crime podcast in the late 1900s about Jack the Ripper.
by lamplight. Yeah. Speaking into a wax cylinder.
Exactly. Okay. A similar vein, question from Anonymous. Presumably, similar murders took place around the same time, even ones that got similar contemporary media attention. Why is this one so famous and not the others?
So there were similar murders around the same time. Famously, there was a set of murders from a killer who became known as Leather Apron. And in fact, for a while, it was suspected that Jack the Ripper and Leather Apron were the same person, but eventually the police decided that they were two separate killers. I think the major reason that Jack the Ripper has persisted is because we still don't know who that was. We still got no idea, despite what people like Russell Edwards are saying. We still have no idea who that was, and people love a mystery. People love a mystery. I don't think it's the only reason, because we know who Ed Gein was, we know who John Wayne Gacy was, we know who Ted Bundy was, but there's something about Jack the Ripper that holds people's attention, and I think the mystery around it is a significant part of that.
Do we know who Leather Apron was?
I'm not a ripperologist. No. I'm certainly not an apronologist.
Okay, just asking. Good.
I could find out, but I'd just Google it the same as anyone else can.
Yeah, good. Another anonymous question. With continuing public interest in revealing the identity of Jack the Ripper, how do we keep the focus on the victims to ensure they aren't unfairly overlooked?
That's really hard, and it's a hard problem not just for Jack the Ripper, but all serial murderers, right? Is who can name Ed Gein's victims, who can name Ted Bundy's victims, who can name Fred West's victims. There's these names are household names, but their victims really aren't. I think one of the things that we can do is, as I tried to in this talk, is highlight the fact that the victims' stories are very often forgotten. And try and do that, but it's a really hard problem to solve. It's probably something that the true crime community need to be stepping up to as well, and some of them do. There's some really awesome people who will go out there and advocate for the victims and make sure that these people, their names are not forgotten and they don't, as I say, just become a footnote in somebody else's story. But it's a very hard problem to solve.
Yeah, true. Okay, now we're going to change the format. Instead of a Q&A, this is going to be a SNNQA statement. The next question. Anonymous. At the start, I hoped you'd found that the suspect had an affair with the policeman's wife, but now I'd just like to know more about the victims. So that's a good thing.
And it's something that's very commonly assumed, that all of the victims of Jack the Ripper were prostitutes, and that almost becomes an excuse at times as well. Like, well, they were only prostitutes, and they're very often just referred to as prostitutes rather than just being referred to as women or even people. They're very often referred to as prostitutes. I did, in the initial version of this talk, I suggested that maybe the reason that Aaron Kosminski's semen was on the Shawl was maybe Aaron Kosminski was known to frequent prostitutes in London. Maybe he had a liaison with Catherine Eddowes. But actually, there's very little evidence that Catherine Eddowes was a prostitute, despite this thing that Jack the Ripper's victims were all prostitutes. There's some suggestions that she engaged in casual prostitution.
Okay.
But when at the inquest, her family didn't talk about her in those terms. It seems to be something that maybe she did occasionally, or maybe not at all. It's hard to say. So it's really easy for people to make assumptions about the victims and to characterize them in those ways. So I would suggest looking into the individuals themselves and reading about their stories and their lives wherever you can.
Yeah. Okay. Considering that you didn't actually want to give this talk initially or research the subject, the question is, what got you interested in the topic enough to put the work in for this talk?
The short version is somebody was wrong on the internet. I saw the newspaper report at the time in the Mail on Sunday saying, "Hey, we found Jack the Ripper," and I was looking for something to talk about for Skeptics with a K that week, and so I looked into that and was kind of, oh, this kind of doesn't seem to be stacking up to me. This seems to be unusual, and so I covered it back then just as a story for us to talk about. A few years later, the BBC did a documentary, not related to the Shawl, but they also identified Aaron Kosminski as Jack the Ripper. So I covered it again for Skeptics with a K then. And then when I saw the newspaper headlines, I was like, fucking hell, I thought I'd already debunked this. And so, I went to town on that. But fundamentally, it's just I'm a skeptic, and pointing out misinformation is part of what I do.
Oh, God. If and when Ben Goldacre publishes a book about Jack the Ripper, you will be doomed. Okay, next question. Along those lines, how many hours did you actually spend on this? Rough number?
I wish I could tell you. So as I say, I've covered the story, the Aaron Kosminski story, several times now. So I've done it for my podcast twice, 3 times. I've done it for my podcast actually. I've written an article for The Skeptic about it. I've written this talk about it. There's probably 50, 60 hours of work that has gone into it in total. Not sufficient, quite honestly, but I've been as rigorous as I think I've been able to.
Worth it. Grady Earthling, how come such scant evidence gets taken seriously? Are sensational headlines so lucrative?
Well, I think in the case of Russell Edwards, and not wanting to impugn the man's honor, I'm sure he's a lovely bloke. He had a book to sell. And the Shawl doesn't seem to have been taken seriously until Edwards purchased it and wrote the book. The article he wrote in the Mail on Sunday announcing the findings was literally days before the book was published. It was very much that piece that he wrote was just promotion for his book. And so I think that's fundamentally where that has came from, is this quite weak piece of evidence has been seized on by somebody who's a big Ripperologist fan. He now runs Jack the Ripper tours in London. And so it's a platform for him to sell a book, I think, fundamentally. And getting an article in the Mail on Sunday about it means that more people learn about his book.
Did the scientist who did the analysis get any notoriety or celebrity out of it, or even money?
So I know someone who was in his class at Liverpool, John Moores.
Okay.
And at one point, I'm given to understand, maybe this isn't true, but this is what I've been told, is one of the classes that he ran was criticizing forensic evidence, and he had to ban his students from tearing his papers apart because they kept coming in with deconstructions of his Jack the Ripper story. Maybe that story isn't true, but I'm given to understand that that was the case. This guy, Yari, he does other investigations, other cold case investigations. And in fact, one of the things that he did recently was he did an investigation where he claimed he had discovered the body of one of the missing Moors murders victims, one of the victims of Myra Hindley and Ian Brady. And someone had gone, and I think it was Russell Edwards again, had gone out and found this and gone digging around on the moors and found what they thought was the body of one of the missing victims. And it turned out it was some plants. So there was nothing found, but Yari was still on social media. He was on his Twitter going, we found this, we're analyzing it, it's going to be great. And then, of course, it was a big nothing. So this is something he seems to make a habit of, but it seems to be very much in his relationship with with Russell Edwards. In Edwards' article, he claims that Yari works on cold cases for Interpol. Maybe that's true, and I hope he's awesome at it.
Yeah. Good. Another anonymous question. Do you know if the journal that had to issue the warning had any reason not to outright retract the paper?
I mean, that's up to the editors of the journal. Retraction is quite a big thing to do. I think an expression of concern is not quite as big a thing to do, but still quite a big thing to do. Personally, I would have probably retracted the paper if it was my journal to edit. But yeah, the story there is the article was published. There were immediate comments that came in from people saying this analysis is terrible. Jari Louhelainen came back and responded with rebuttals to those arguments. That went back and forth. But as I say, the argument was enough for the editor to say, can we see your raw data, please? And then Jari was not able to present it. Yeah. And so that was when they said, okay, we're going to publish this and say, publish an expression of concern saying, we're not sure that this is reliable. I suppose it doesn't mean that it's not reliable, just that the journal's editors are not convinced it is reliable. And these were very much novel techniques that were developed for this purpose, for okay. Analyzing this shawl specifically. Okay,
makes sense. Okay, do you have a favorite fictional representation of the Whitehall murders?
No.
Fine enough. This is going to be quick.
Well, I think it should. I don't think we should be telling stories about things like this. I mean, I suppose you could do a nice serious drama that, a nice character piece that delves in and tells the stories of these people. But the way Jack the Ripper is almost revered, and as I say, there's stuff like Robert Bloch was doing where he's a demon or a monster, or Alan Moore's doing a story where it's a Masonic satanic conspiracy, I don't think we should be setting people up as cultural icons like that, especially not when they've done stuff like this.
Yeah. So, summarizing the next question, what's the point? With so much time passed, is there any reason to actually determine Jack the Ripper's identity?
At this point, I think it's just people want an answer to the question. And I would personally much prefer if people just let it go, rather than continually hauling this question over the coals again and again and again. And it's less of an issue now. As I said, when that Star Trek episode went out, 1967, the children and grandchildren of Jack the Ripper's victims, some of them were definitely alive. Others are plausibly alive. Seeing the person who killed your mother or your grandmother on telly as a Star Trek villain, how's that going to affect somebody? It's less of an issue now because, we're long past the living memory of those individuals. People who are great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren aren't going to have fond memories of that person because they would have never known them, right?
Yeah.
But it's still, it makes me uncomfortable.
We are now approaching what I would call crossover territory. So a question from Garnet. I'm confused. Which Doctor Who episodes does this relate to?
Well, happily, Doctor Who would never do anything so crass as Star Trek did, and do the Jack the Ripper bit. To my understanding, I think Jack the Ripper is mentioned in one Doctor Who story on television. It's appeared in other media, but on television, Jack the Ripper is mentioned in one story. That's a story from 1977 called The Talons of Weng Chiang, which is about a time-traveling alien. No, it's not. He's not even an alien. He's a human. He's a time traveler known as Magnus Greel, who's also known as the Butcher of Brisbane, who goes back in time to Victorian London and starts killing young women. And he's not set up to be Jack the Ripper, but there is a comment from another character who says, "Oh, I thought Jolly Jack himself was back up to his old tricks." And that's it. That's the extent of a Jack the Ripper reference in Doctor Who.
Okay, that's sorted out then. The next one is more speculative. It's been suggested Jack the Ripper likely had medical knowledge. Which incarnation of the Doctor do you think is responsible for the murders?
Now, the doctor's not going to engage in serial murder. Obviously, they're not. The story of whether Jack the Ripper had medical knowledge is really interesting because there's very conflicting reports on this. To my understanding, when I've done the research on this, it doesn't actually seem to be the case. It doesn't stack up that Jack the Ripper had detailed medical knowledge. But that was a story for a long time that it was some sort of surgical precision that the Ripper had. Although from what I understand, a lot of this came from the fact that he seemed to know apparently just where to go to extract the organs or whatever gruesome things he was doing. But again, that's a Texas sharpshooter fallacy. That's assuming that was what, rather than just he was extracting what he found, you assume that that's what he was going for in the first place, which is not necessarily the case. So I'm not persuaded that Jack the Ripper actually had medical knowledge, but maybe they did. And in fact, in a lot of early depictions, like, as I say, in the Hammer film Room to Let, Jack the Ripper is portrayed as a doctor who's now in hiding after long after the fact. Is very often is portrayed as a medical man in media, although Aaron Kosminski very much not medically trained.
Okay. That's that with all the questions. Thank you very much. We've got one more comment. I think we'll finish on something positive. So here we have, this is more of a comment than a question. Go to QED.
Yes, definitely go to QED. Go to QED. Go and book your tickets now. I can tell you that during the course of my talk, 4 tickets for QED have been sold during the course of me actually speaking. So you should definitely go and buy your ticket to QED because the numbers are dwindling fast. And if you come to QED, absolutely. If you come to QED and tell me that you watch this talk, I will give you a cuddle.
Ooh, that's quite a promise. Good. So a little bit of housekeeping at the end. We hopefully will all see you again on July 24th. We haven't announced the speaker yet, so keep an eye out on our usual channels, Facebook, social media, of course, our website. Reminder to join us in the Occam's Razor, sitp.online/virtual pub is the link you need. And I want to say thanks again to Mike for this wonderful talk, and I've quite enjoyed our Q&A afterwards. And I also want to thank the people in the background. We have the always beloved tech goblins, Matty and David. And of course, my charming assistant / understudy, Dave Microscopy Jenkins. Thank you very much for your help, guys. That's it from us. As always, stay safe, stay healthy, stay skeptical. Good night.